never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't roll them dice. You better roll them dice. You never know if it could change your life.
I just took Rob the Dungeons and Dragons Magic the Gathering survey by Hasbro this morning before we recorded, asking me, a consumer of their products, what I think about things.
And what do you think about things, Matt? What are your thoughts on products and services provided by Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast?
I love satisfying my wants and needs by consuming goods and services. It's one of my favorite things to do. Here's a fun fact, Rob, that I was reading as we were digging into some of the history of various editions of Dungeons and Dragons, which is a former TSR employee that then came in when Wizards was taking over. Is they found out that TSR, for its 25-year existence, had never once done any marketing surveys.
Well, why would they?
No. Well, why and that's a good point. It's they all played the game. They knew what they wanted, right?
They knew exactly what they were doing. Right. Their game was perfect and there were no problems, and why ask what people want? That's ridiculous.
My favorite question in the
Matt,
survey,
when Henry Ford was creating the Model T, he famously said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And You know what? Gary Gygax was the same way.
Exactly. You can have a Model T in any color you want, so long as
you can have Dungeons and Dragons in any edition you want, so long as it's one.
That's right. The most interesting question in Hasbro's marketing survey was one that was asked for both the brands of Magic the Gathering and Dungeons and Dragons, and it went along the lines of do you think this property has reached its potential? Is going to get better in the next few years, is on the up and up, or is past its prime for each one?
And what did you say, Matt? What did you say to those questions?
I said for Magic, maybe I'm just being an asshole here, but for Magic the Gathering, I said past its prime, and for Dungeons and Dragons, I said on the up and up.
That's just a very funny question to ask. Also, why would you include the option to say that it's past its prime? You're just inviting a bunch of people to tell you uncomfortable truths. I mean,
they want good criticism, maybe.
It's a good question. Magic the Gathering, sorry friends, it holds no interest to me. My CCG days are behind me. But I guess the thing about both of these brands is that they are, and again, no offense, but they are primarily popular and financially viable because of the, cultural hegemony that they enjoy, right? I love Dungeons and Dragons. I played Dungeons and Dragons a lot. In a free market with no, if you presented a totally, random population of people who have never heard of any game ever with D&D and Powered by the Apocalypse and Savage Worlds and, just give them 10 and we're play this and find which one you like. Does anyone really believe that those people would always choose just based on the system alone Dungeons and Dragons, or they would choose it 90% of the time, which represents its market share? I do not think so. And same for Magic the Gathering. There are many better collectible card games, but they lack just sort of the marketing, the popularity, the whatever that MTG has. And that's neither, good nor bad. I play D&D because I like having access to lots of stuff. But, it's not about the brand, except that the brand is unstoppable.
They got rid of all of the I asked someone at Target about this. They got rid of all of the Magic the Gathering cards at Target.
That's right, because people are we are in the middle of some kind of speculative frenzy. Capital is desperately seeking somewhere to receive greater returns because interest rates are too low.
Yes.
And so people are speculating on Pokemon cards and Magic the Gathering cards and Bitcoin and NFTs and
So they got rid of them because they were just a nuisance. People kept stealing them. And,
right.
And they don't like that when people steal Magic the Gathering cards.
Healthy economy, Matt, is what that says to me. Is Pokemon cards and Magic the Gathering cards are skyrocketing in value as true stores of real and meaningful wealth.
Which is why
like tulip bulbs.
Like tulip bulbs, which is why if you'll subscribe to our Patreon, what we're working on next month is developing the first ever NFTs for Magic the Gathering cards. That's right.
That's right.
I don't exactly know what that means, but NFT MTG coming your way.
That's right. You heard it here first, folks.
But actually, what we're going to do today is answer some of your letters about world building, Dungeon Master advice, etc., etc. It's Dungeon Master of None.
That's right, and I'm Dungeon Master Rob.
I'm Dungeon Master Matt.
And we're going to answer some questions. It's been a while since we've done a mailbag. We've had a lot of things going on, but we're sorry. We always want to answer your questions. Please always send us questions. We will get to them eventually. All right, so I've got a good question from Martin. Martin writes, "Hello, Matt and Rob. Thank you for all the time and efforts you put in to make your podcasts. I enjoy listening to them and learning more of the history of D&D and all the different campaign settings out there. We started playing D&D a little over a year ago with all inexperienced D&D players. We switched DMing so we can all experience D&D from both sides. That's really cool.
It's a great way to start, really.
More beginning groups should do that, though it's a little tricky. We do have an issue, though, with the 5e rules about death and death saving throws. So Martin has a series of questions. So the question one is, how does one recover from death in D&D 5th edition? We're not completely sure. Roll 3 successful death saves at a DC 10, or 1 on a natural 20, recovers to 1 HP, or someone makes a medicine check to stabilize someone. Does this person recover to 1 HP? Or someone heals the character for at least 1 HP, or use some special feature, magic, spell, artifact designed to do so. Am I missing any ways to recover? Are the DCs correct? It feels strange that math tells us it's often better to let yourself drop to 0 HP because negative HP is ignored, and then let yourself be healed instead of trying to avoid dropping to 0 HP. Role-playing wise, it feels much more logical to try to avoid going down at all costs. Also, no one seems to like the death save mechanism, and my fellow DMs even decided to overrule character death every time because players always had bad luck when it comes to death saving rolls. Now, there's a couple other questions, but let's answer this first, Matt.
Yeah. Oh, well, this is interesting, and this is a great question coming from the perspective of someone who is relatively new to the game, like how that feels to you, right? Because it definitely feels a certain way to me as someone who's played the game a long time. I would say you're broadly correct in how death works, right? You die in 5th edition D&D when you drop to 0 hit points and you fail 3 death saving throws, and that can be either making a check or, when you get hit or take damage when you're down, right, it adds kind of an automatic failure.
Right.
But your list of things that can get you back up, like someone heals you, right, or you roll a natural 20, or you make 3 saves at a DC 10, that's correct.
I think that's correct. I think those are the only ways to recover from being it's incapacitated, right? It's not unconscious. It's incapacitated at 0, right? Is the technical the words are very precise, and so yes, so this is exactly right. And Martin, you're not wrong that this is a little counterintuitive, and many players and DMs don't like it. So full disclosure, for my first year of playing D&D 5th edition, I had not read these rules very carefully, and I continued to use negative hit points the way that they had worked in 3.5 and Pathfinder. That was bad and wrong. I shouldn't have done that. I just sort of assumed that things were the same. And once I realized the rules were different, I really had some difficulty adapting to it. So there are a couple of schools of thought about this. And one advantage of this system is that it involves less math, and it's a little bit more abstracted than you are negative however many hit points and, somebody has to heal you for that amount. The disadvantage, though, is to me, or to a lot of people, it feels a little bit too abstracted and a little gamey, and also it's very, very hard to die. again, this is both good and bad. So
well, Marty is telling us that at least the feeling at your table is it's too easy to die.
Oh, it's too
as
easy to die.
Dungeon
Oh,
masters
interesting.
have decided to overrule characters' deaths,
Hmm.
which I want to say is an interesting way to go, right? Because if it seems like characters are having bad luck. Now, if you overrule one character's death when they're like, you just rolled poorly, right? You failed 3 death saving throws. I'm going to say you didn't die. That's you want to be careful with that, because are you going to do that for everyone, right?
Right. Well, you pretty much have to do it for everyone once you've done it for one person. So this is interesting, and it makes me wonder about Martin's campaign. It's not good or bad. I don't think I have ever had players leave someone down for more than a round. Like, usually there's enough healing potions or something else. Oh, this is technically included in your list of things, Martin, but you can also pour a potion in somebody's mouth. That's
Right.
a way that's healing. So usually when this happens in my games, somebody will make a priority of getting that person up. And now, in theory, if there's a bunch of AoEs flying around, or if one enemy really wants to make somebody dead, this happened in a Critical Role campaign very dramatically, players can die, but it takes at least 2 attacks or 3 attacks or several saved throws for somebody to actually die. And 3 rounds of combat is a long time in game. So the actual, usually people think that the death is too hard, or it's too difficult to die.
But if the feeling, at least through play at your table, is it's too easy to die, right? Then you can absolutely maybe come up with a house rule for your table, right? Of when you fall unconscious, right, you have to fail 5 death saving throws or something like that, right? Because we don't want players to die. One other thing I want to point out is Martine says, someone makes a medicine check to stabilize someone. Does this person recover to 1 HP? And the answer is no, right? There is one tricky thing about these rules is that you can be stable but not regain a hit point. So there are basically 3 outcomes that can happen to you when you're unconscious and making death saving throws. You can die, you can become stable, which means you stay at 0 HP, but you don't have to make any more death saving throws. This happens when someone does a medicine check on you. Or you can basically roll a natural 20 and start at 1 hit point. Or, a similar thing happens when you're healed. The last thing I want to point out about this first set of questions is it does seem like it makes the incentive to drop to 0 because that soaks your wounds. And I'd say, yeah, I guess that's true. But remember, the potential loss of a turn is going to be way more impactful on a fight or a dramatic scene than the extra hit points, right?
I mean, one issue about that is, you can just soak an enormous hit and drop to 0, and there's not a huge disincentive to do that. But
other than the massive instant death rules, which I guess is the one thing that does count that you do have negative hit points for. Right? You have negative hit points, but only in this one case. The instant death rules.
Well, let's talk about massive damage in a second. So This brings me to, it's a good point, but let's get to Martine's next question. Has death always worked this way in D&D, and how do other editions handle death and death saving throws? For now, we have agreed that death should not be decided by the dice, but by the quest monsters at hand. So now if you drop to 0 HP, you're just down for the rest of combat. After combat, you will automatically recover to 1 HP if your party won. Only high-level spells, potions, and special items can be used to recover a character. DM's discretion. I like this. And I think this is a perfectly good narrative way to deal with death in combat or going down in combat. Previous editions, as we mentioned, had you drop to negative hit points and be unconscious. Even earlier editions, if you ran out of hit points, you were dead. Simple as that. No, death has not always worked this way.
Yeah, a couple points. In 4th edition, right, it was basically kind of similar to this one. You had the 3 death saving throws that happened if you dropped to 0 hit points. You didn't have, but you also had negative hit points, right? You also didn't have negative hit points, right? The feeling is like, oh, if you're at negative 10 hit points, like, what's the point of, like, I only have a first level spell? What's the point of trying to bring back my ally in this combat? The likelihood that they'll still just be at a lower number of negative hit points is pretty high. It's not worth it. So it's like, oh, your cleric can always bring someone back. So you start counting from, 0 when you apply healing hit points. In earliest editions, right, if you were at 0 hit points, your character was dead, right? That's probably the simplest way to do it. But, people are kind of unhappy about that because that happens a lot. And if you want to play a game where it happens a lot, that's fun, right? Pathfinder, it has a different system that's more based on 3.5, but it's also incredibly deadly. If my memory serves me correctly, Rob, Pathfinder had 0 hit points, which hardly ever came up because it's 1 hit point where you're like at half capacity. You could do like 1 action. And then if you were in negative hit points but less than negative 10, you were dying. And then, like, if you were below negative 10, you were dead.
Yeah. And in 2nd edition, and it's been a bit since I looked, so this is from memory and don't quote me, but Pathfinder 2nd edition now has a condition that you acquire every time you go unconscious, injury or exhaustion or something like that, which adds a cumulative penalty, and if it happens enough times, you die. So this brings me to the 3rd question, which is Martinez.
But yes, summary for that question. No, it has not.
Yeah, it's been different in basically every edition.
Yeah.
So the 3rd question is, how do you handle death in D&D? Do you use homebrew, or have you done so in previous campaigns? So as you just heard, I don't intentionally use homebrew, but sometimes I make up the rules because I didn't read them very carefully. I really like, again, Matt and I both prefer at this point to have fewer numbers, fewer things to keep track of, fewer roles in general. That being said, I really do like the system of you acquire an injury or a stacking debuff of some sort whenever you go down to discourage what you just said, deliberately dropping to 0 points, or making so that there is some sort of consequence to going unconscious. Not to be punitive, but it just from a verisimilitude standpoint, it feels weird that you can just be repeatedly bludgeoned into unconsciousness and suffer no negative consequence. I have not implemented this in any of my games because I don't want to punish my players, but if I had a choice, and in future games I would have some sort of homebrew where you can only go down a certain number of times before you are either gravely injured or dead. But I do generally use the rules as are because I like that it is hard for heroes to die. My main issue with them, though, is that and this is a big problem with D&D in general that I have not yet solved and nobody has really adequately modeled, but everybody fights exactly as well at 1 hit point as they do at 200, no matter how many they have. And again, it's good to not have a bunch of like needlessly complicated rules, but this is something that I do wish that Dungeons and Dragons modeled a little bit better.
So I'll disagree with Rob here. I think it's absolutely fine that everyone fights at the same strength at 2 hit points as opposed to 200. This is just because I have played a lot of games where as you take hits, you start to suck more, and it just kind of starts a spiral at the table that's unfun. And as long as you decouple in your mind hit points as in pieces of your meat getting cut off, and just we know once you cross this threshold, you get knocked out, right? I'm okay with that. I also have no desire to add a sort of Pathfinder 2E style stacking. Not that there's anything wrong with it. Stacking debuff for when you've fallen unconscious in a fight. Just because with some of my newer players, it's hard enough to get them to like not let each other die or anything that I don't want there to be any additional penalties. Now, I will say,
as I have said, I would not implement this broadly and in every single one of my games. Some of my players would suffer with this rule, but depending on the circumstances and the level of play, I might have more advanced players deal with a rule like this. But Matt's not wrong that some groups already struggle with this enough as it is.
Now, here's my advice is that, of course, this would be advice that you shouldn't just implement without telling anyone. This would be a conversation to have with the players next time you're in the Dungeon Master seat, which would be, there's been some disagreement about these death rules. Do we want to come up with a new agreement at our table, kind of like you have here? Or do we want to just try and use the death rules as written and say that when you fail 3 death saving throws, you are dead? You will find that, at least I have found that once players have experienced a character death, that they sort of grasp the system a little bit better. And when someone goes down, they're like, ooh, I know we have other things to accomplish, but my main goal right now is getting over there and pouring a potion down that person's throat, because I've seen it happen once. We got really unlucky. It can happen again. I don't want my friend to die.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. This is actually a really good series of questions. We've talked about death in D&D before, but I don't know that we've gone into detail about how previous editions did it, and I think we've talked a little bit about how the death rules work, but not maybe as much as we should. So this is a good question. And there are some, like with so many things about 5th edition, the current system is good. There are some issues with it that other people have taken a crack at fixing, and we have taken a crack at fixing others. There's some interesting homebrew solutions to this. I like yours, to be honest. I like what your group has done. I think that if it works out in play, especially, that this is a good way to handle player death or unconsciousness. You know, I often, not to get off track, but like the great thing about narrative solutions is that they're often more satisfying. The problem with narrative solutions is that it places additional pressure on the dungeon master or game master to adjudicate and make fair and consistent decisions. So this is not a problem with your game or with any game in general, but it is one of the reasons why role-playing games have rules, partially. And if you have a terrific DM who can handle this and your players are willing to go along with it, then that's good. Just the problem is that this requires consistent and fair and wise rulings.
Damn. Thanks again for the question. All right, here's a letter from David. Question for the podcast. How do you prefer to read through a published adventure? I'm thinking of one of the longer official campaign books. Do you skim it to get the gist? Do you read each encounter word for word? How do you keep track of the major plot threads while also digging into the details of particular encounters? Best, David.
This is a good question. And I would encourage, if anybody is wondering how to do this, we've done a lot of reviews of different adventures at this point, and listen to those, because one of the things that we talk about, and unfortunately this is not going to allow you to apply one standard to every adventure, but one thing that we talk about is whether or not the adventure is meant to be read start to finish, and if it isn't, what the best way to read it is. So if you are reading something like Storm King's Thunder, or, well, that's a good example. Let's just go with that one.
Yeah.
The best way, or frankly, the only way to really prepare yourself is to read cover to cover, and then, in my opinion, go back and make notes and prepare given what you know. If it's something like well, if it's something like some of the more recent adventures, something like
Icewind Dale, where there's
Rime
sort
of the Frost Maiden, or even Curse of Strahd, you can jump around, and you should. Dragon Heist actually does a really good job of telling you how to read it, because there's a lot you don't need to read, and it will tell you, go here, read these things, and that is why it's one of my favorite adventures, and I think it's really good for both new players and DMs. But unfortunately, for a lot of published adventures, you really have to read it start to finish, because there's information that you need that you will not be able to get unless you have read the whole book.
If you're pressed for time, here is my sort of my approach, right? Is that you definitely want to sort of, what you were saying, skim it to get the gist. But what that skimming means in this context means there's usually on these published adventures sort of the background, adventure summary, plot thing. That is something you don't want to skim, that you want to definitely read in detail, right? And then you sort of read in detail the kind of like beginning of each chapter, and then sort of skim, okay, well, what happens in this section or chapter or stage of the adventure? And then read very, very carefully the sort of concluding part of that. And then do that again and again, and then read the very end section in a lot of detail. So that's how I approach, if I'm short for time, I don't have time to read the whole thing in detail, the skim section. And then right before each week, you're reading the possible encounters that could come up in a ton of detail.
You really can't always read the whole thing, so you do need to skim. And this is a skill that Matt and I have acquired through studying history, where every book is too long and full of things that you don't need to know. And so you become very good at strategically and intelligently skimming through. And so some tips are, like Matt said, which sections are critical, read those. And then, check the subject headings, read what the beginnings and the ends of certain paragraphs. You can get what you need. And some books are better about this than others. I'm expressing frustration, but what the older campaigns required you really to read everything, because there's critical information that helps you.
It was often hidden, and you didn't really know it was going to show up, right?
And newer books are much better at this. Yeah. They say, you need to know this, or like, if you want to know more about why X person does X, go to this section. But a lot of the older adventures don't do that.
Last question is like keeping track of plot threads, right? So here's, if you're pressed for time, the internet is often your friend. Usually some dedicated person online has made like a flow chart of the adventure. Not always, but often. And then if they haven't, after that skim, if you can do your best to, I like flow charts for my adventure planning. If you could make one of your own sort of by your own hand of a published adventure, that will be super, super useful for you. You can tuck it in the back cover of the book. So that's how I keep track of the plot threads.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. And no, I don't have a better suggestion than Matt's, to be honest. Yeah, I have my own way of doing this, but it's just a lot of improvisation, and I find that if you do a good job of, sorry to get off track again, but like, it really depends on like your villains, right? If you're thinking about your villains or your prime actors and you're wondering where they are in the story and trying to make them active, then it helps you to sort of keep those plot threads going through the adventure. But again, a lot of older adventures have villains that are either completely uninvolved or don't show up till the end, or are just sitting in their wizard's tower waiting for players to arrive. And so, if it's something like, again, Dragon Heist, and they are actively involved and the book gives you ways to demonstrate that they're actually involved, that's it makes it easier to keep those plot threads going.
Okay, thanks again, David.
All right, this one's from Brian. Brian writes, Aloha, DMs Matt and Rob. Aloha, Brian. Long-time listener, first-time emailer. I really enjoy and appreciate your show. I started showing up for the advice and stay for the jokes and commentary. Good, I'm glad somebody thinks they're funny. I either need to thank you or blame you for getting me interested in Call of Cthulhu. Blame us. It's good, but you may find yourself suffering for many reasons.
Mm-hmm.
After many years of assuming the game would not interest me, after listening to your discussions and prep session, I find myself ready to place an order for the starter set, which I imagine will be followed by more purchases. Money that should probably go toward home renovation projects, artisanal coffee, settling that persistent psychic reading debt, or giving some money to public radio instead of changing the dial to bad radio whenever they have a pledge drive. Good list of things that I also spend money on, Brian.
We love our tote bags. They're great for storing your rule books and dice bags.
That's right. Anyway, a comment and a question. Comment. You mentioned the Lovecraft Country show recently. The book that served as a source was written by Matt Ruff. I have not seen the show, but read the book recently and thought it was excellent. If you have a chance to read it, I would love to hear your thoughts. Even though Matt is a white man, I thought the way he presented both the supernatural horrors the family confronts in the story and the real horrors of dealing with everyday racism and potential violence were very compelling. And the question is, I've recently become a huge Dungeon Crawl Classics fan, both for the system and the community. Have you ever played DCC and discussed it on the podcast? If not, I would love to hear some of your thoughts on DCC or Mutant Crawl Classics if you have played that version. Thank you again for the podcast. Your wisdom and humor helped me get through some long stretches of solitude. Literally, as I binged a lot of your older episodes during a 14-day quarantine period in a hotel room in Singapore at the start of the year. I'm glad we could help, Brian. Cheers, Brian.
Great questions
comment and question.
Comments.
So
where do you want to start? Let's start with Lovecraft Country and Matt Ruff.
So Brian, I have not read the book. It is sitting on my bookshelf, and I hope to get to it soon. I did watch the show, and if you liked the book, I would encourage you to watch it because, well, the show has some issues, and especially with the ending. But I thought that it did a really good job of highlighting exactly the things that you mentioned, the combination of supernatural horrors and the very real horrors of everyday racism. Some episodes better than others. I found the show also really good for coming up with ideas for adventures, primarily because each episode or many of the episodes are sort of self-contained little like mini vignettes that deal with very striking thematic elements. There's some that's like one that's like a very like horror haunted house type episode, and there's one that's like a great really bizarre Afrofuturism sci-fi romp, but I have heard really good things about the book and its portrayal of racism and its combination of that with supernatural horror, so I will bump that up my list and actually read it. But it's a good recommendation, and I've heard really, really good things about it from people that I trust in the science fiction fantasy community and in the TTRPG community.
Yeah, it's a great show. At least, we don't often get like supernatural horror shows that aren't like Monster Attack type things. So
yeah, this was the other thing about it. Even when it was faulty, I liked it because it was different, right? It tried and sometimes succeeded to do something different, but I would rather watch something new that's like a little messy than, sorry, but I only have so many like perfectly flawlessly made detective shows left in me. I love that, but I would rather watch something new these days.
On to the question. I'm also a fairly big DCC or Dungeon Crawl Classics fan. So DCC, has its own sort of retro clone or OSR, old school Renaissance system that is like a simplified, much easier to use, basic or first edition, zeroth edition D&D rules. And if you're looking for an OSR system, my favorite is still Labyrinth Lord, but DCC, it's a fine system. What I really like about Dungeon Crawl Classics, Rob, is there are a ton of great adventures and modules for you to steal from that are published. And they tend to be on the just really good, like, wacky side. Players go into a dungeon and there's a cave made out of flesh and a bunch of mirrors that duplicate everyone, and a wizard that's building robots and stuff like that. It's really good stuff. And I think I would recommend, especially if you're like, I want a bunch of low-level adventures to start my players off on, is, Goodman Games, who makes the DCC adventures, has a couple of compilations. I think the first one's called The Adventure Begins. That's like 30 modules for like 0th, 1st, or 2nd level, right? And how many times have you wanted, Rob, just like, all right, we got to start a new campaign. I need some stuff for the 1st level. There's 30 things for like $20. It's really good.
Yeah. Yeah. I
mean, there's something about old school. It's like you can get more in less space, right? You can like, here's 4 pages and this is a whole adventure, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've not had a chance to play it. I have looked at what's on offer, and it's great stuff. Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things about OSR stuff is it should be, if you're not playing like Labyrinth Lord or DCC itself, it should be easy enough to convert to 5th edition, because you're like, this is one of those things. I'll look up it's the same thing that's in 5th edition. I'll just look up its stats in 5th edition, right? Maybe tone it down a little bit for 1st level characters. It also has lots of adventures that are kind of like grinder adventures. Have you heard of these, Rob?
I have not.
Okay, so this is the basic idea of a grinder adventure. Is like everyone rolls up X number of 0th level characters, and the ones who survive get to be the PCs, right?
I have heard of these. Never mind. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
I would also recommend one of my favorite modules that I have run is I think it's called Perils of the Purple Planet. And if that name doesn't tell you sort of the gist of a lot of DCC stuff, well, then there you go, right? So, a little bit of space opera, planet and sandal, sword and planet type stuff. Anyway, that one was a lot of fun too.
Sandal and planet, sword and sandal and
planet.
No, I'm making
sword,
stuff
sandal,
up.
planet.
Sword, sandal, planet. No, I love it.
Yeah, yeah. Perils of the Purple Planet. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. But yeah, I would say if you're interested in like, I want a bunch of kind of wacky, old school adventures to try out. Pick up one of their compilations of like low level modules, and just read through them. I think it's there's just always stuff you can steal from these kind of modules. You're like, this room would be perfect here.
Thank you so much for the question, Brian, and thanks for listening.
Hi there. This is Georgina, and I'm attempting to build a new campaign setting. I'm mostly writing this to publish it eventually, more than me to DM in, and also as a creative outlet to help with the hellscape that is this year. Anyway, the reason I want to get in touch is that you guys have obviously read a lot of campaign setting guides and homebrewed your own worlds a lot. What are the things that you think you need or really want from a setting guide? And if you were creating one, what would you leave up to the DM? I ask because your podcasts about world building are great and inspirational, but by design, you're talking about homebrewing for your own campaign, not a setting guide. So I guess I want to make sure I'm focusing my efforts in the right places. Thanks, and keep up what you're doing, Georgina.
This is a good question.
Mm-hmm,
because I'm also one of the things that we're working on for our Patreon, and also just in general, I'm working on, is I really want to condense this is both to motivate myself, but also to revisit is condense one of my older homebrew settings, Thunder on the Steppe, into a brief campaign guide, campaign setting, campaign Bible, and then produce other materials, but have it down to a few pages so that I can present that or share that. And there are varying approaches to this. Valorane is that's 5 pages, 10 pages, something like that. And that's got everything. That's a perfect example of a tight, comprehensive campaign setting. You could do more, you could do less, but I when I think about what I want to put in my campaign, or campaign Bible, that's my sort of guiding star.
And the interesting thing about that one is it's all you would need as long as you have all of the adventure quests, locations, other NPCs mapped out in your own notes in your own brain. So like that's what I would prepare if it was just for me, right?
Right. So to be clear, that's the bare minimum, and it still asks a lot of DMs. The other, on
the other side, right?
The other side is in, you know what we're going to say here is Eberron, right? Is every Eberron book is perfect and beautiful and has no flaws and
not you, Forge of War.
Yeah. With one major exception. But the thing is, they're long, right? And so depending on whether or not you want to produce that much material, that's one thing. But the Eberron books are perfect. They're well organized. They have enough detail, but not too much detail. And what Keith Baker's so good at is he gives you exactly enough to work with and leaves you enough to get excited about and build your own stories from. So these all include detailed information on regions, settings, characters, magic items, spells, etc., and not too much of everything. So
right.
This is a really unhelpful answer, Georgina, because really it's as much as you want.
No, I think it is helpful in that a good campaign setting published for other people asks a lot of questions, a lot of interesting questions that are all coherent within the campaign setting, but doesn't always give you very many answers, right? Because that's the part you're leaving up to the dungeon master. And a good campaign setting published for other people just has more and more details and interesting places, right? If I was writing something for just my own campaign, I might sketch out a region and say, this is what this region is about, and then leave it there, knowing that if we ever show up there, I'll fill in some details. But for another person, for every region of the world that's important to the campaign setting, you've got to have places and hooks and NPCs, right? That, of course, not everyone's going to use all the time, but it's just material for you to use, right? Look at a gazetteer section of any of the published campaign settings, and you're like, this is what people want. At least that's what I want from a published campaign setting, right?
In terms of, I think, like what's essential, right? The things that are going to be easy for you to make are the things that you're excited about, and your campaign setting should include all of the cool and different regions and continents and whatever. But if there are things like you have your own unique species, or the existing races have different sub-races or different stats or something like that, that needs to be included. If you have your own magic items or own technology, make sure that that's clearly laid out in the beginning. If there's anything that adjusts the rules, you need to have that, and that's fine. It's a good thing to have in a campaign setting, but you need to make sure
some players and dungeon masters really love, like, oh, here's the additional rules for the campaign setting. Yes. I'm usually not one of those. I'm like, give me places and hooks and ideas. But
if you include those, make sure that those are clearly outlined. And to me, probably like early in the book, like I've always talked about, one thing that I believe strongly is that, setting and system influences the game. And so I think that's important to know, right? So if everybody in your setting rides mechanical horses everywhere, and, tell me that early on so that I know that I'm dealing with a system or a world where everybody's riding an iron horse from town to town. Don't mention it midway and then have the rules for the iron horse at the very end. That to me, I need that information early on to properly understand the game that I'm reading and the game that I'm running.
Yeah. So, I mean, for other people, places, quests, factions, interesting locations, and NPCs, right? At least for me, right? That's what I'm looking for when I am looking for a published campaign setting.
I mean, there's no good answer to this, but I would look at the ones that you like. We mentioned Valorant and Eberron. Those are really, I mean, there's shorter and there's longer, but those I think are sort of the acceptable bounds of, because Valorant is literally bare bones. It doesn't give you really, you have to do a lot of extra work, but it's enough to run the setting, which is perfect, but it's thin.
I would say a couple other letter writers have mentioned a campaign setting I haven't looked at for a long time, but it's a very good book. The Midgard campaign setting, that one's a lot of fun.
We haven't reviewed that yet, but I looked at it and it's good.
Yeah. Okay, thanks Georgina for this letter, and good luck on your world building and campaign setting writing. Sounds like a perfect way to spend this hell year.
All right, so for the remaining 10 minutes or so, we're gonna address some criticism.
Yes.
Which we have received because of our recent episode on the Adventure Zone and our critique of that game and the McElroys. And the first is specifically about what I just said. And this letter is from Matt. And Matt says, I found your podcast because somebody posted episode 163 on the TAZ subreddit. It was nice to hear you articulate so many things about the TAZ podcast. I always felt the graduation arc was subpar at best. As a 51-year-old who has returned to D&D in the past year, I appreciated your critique. It was thoughtful, passionate without being overly damning, and it was honest. That's great stuff. I learned a lot and will employ some of what you said in this part of my campaign. I do have a bummer. Matt.
Yes.
Please say last names correctly of people you're talking about. The TAZ crew says their name in every My Brother, and Me episode, and I believe in many of the TAZ episodes. I feel like it's inconsiderate of the content to mispronounce names. You spoke it phonetically, but it's not how the McElroys say it. I feel like I'm being nitpicky, but it did strike me as odd. So now that I'm done bummering, I can't wait to listen to more of your pods, and I'm super excited I found it. Keep up the great work, and don't hesitate to bring on the bummers. All in all, 163 was a great episode.
Thank you. No, we should try to. I mean, it's the common courtesy for all people is try to learn how to say people's names correctly. My apologies. So it's McElroy's.
McElroy,
right?
Matt.
Oh, it's McElroy's. Okay, sorry.
McElroy.
I forgot which one it was, right?
Well, here's the thing. I got myself mixed up
McElroy.
because I saw this criticism elsewhere, and I was like, shit, am I saying their names wrong? But no, they say it McElroy.
Okay.
Anyway, hopefully we'll never have to say that name again. But if we do, I will make sure that actually, yeah, it's McElroy.
Okay, good, because I'm trusting you here, Rob, on this. If we still got it fucking wrong, then we'll get another set of letters of valid criticism, and we better not. So I'm trusting you here.
McElroy is how it's said.
McElroy. Okay.
McElroy.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt, and we will endeavor to make sure we get that right in the future. Here's another letter from another fan of this recent episode, more like Whack Elroy. Hey guys. Thank you for that. Hey guys, I was a longtime fan of the McElroys. For several years, I traveled to see their live shows, cosplay at live TAZ events, and yes, they were how I got into D&D in the first place. Excellent. Awesome. Actually, my first D&D group was organized through Facebook and the Maximum Fun network of fans, so I have a lot to thank them for. But I also have to thank you for your epic criticisms of the graduation arc. I essentially learned to DM through Griffin's first arc, which you lauded to a degree. I got burnt out on their content as a whole eventually, but when I tuned back in for the graduation arc, I only lasted 2 episodes before I quit. I'd become a DM myself by that time, and through rampant DM resources I sought out, such as your podcast, I learned a tremendous amount before I began running games. To be fair, I think I'm guilty of many of Travis's missteps, as many folks are. I even have a subplot involving a college campus with classroom sessions for each of my players. Oops. However, after hearing your very valid criticisms, I know not to fall into many of the creativity siphoning ruts that this podcast apparently ran into. Also, I didn't realize they were advertising personal loans these days. Gross. So just take it from one formal McElroy mega fan that this recent critique was well-founded and educational. I still think they make good content and are rather good human beings, but I don't I won't be taking many D&D lessons from them anytime soon. But like Matt said, the first arc, helmed by Griffin, was much more coherent and fun, which are the bare minimums I strive for in my dumb fantasy worlds. Thanks for the insights and keep rolling them dice, Maddie.
Maddie, thank you for writing. I do, and I'm glad you found it educational. I want to be clear about something, though, and I think we did emphasize this, but despite the fact that we went, we unleashed our full displeasure upon Travis and Graduation, you do not need to feel the heat of that criticism for your home games. You should try to do better, but the ferocity of our frustration is due to the fact that these are professional D&D players making rookie mistakes. If you, a rookie DM, make rookie mistakes, that's okay. Matt and I did too. We talked about this extensively. We have all done the same things that Travis did, and we want to be generous, but he has had plenty of opportunities to learn and to do better and chose not to, which is why we were so heated in our criticism. So if you do some silly things and your players are like, boy, that sucked, and you fix it, then that nothing more can be asked of you. So don't feel so much pressure from what we said.
I also wanted to reiterate one of the great points that Maddie brought up, which is they have started playing D&D after listening to the first part of the Adventure Zone, which is great. I think shows that has a lot of value. I think one of the things that was really interesting, and I listened to this after we listened to Graduation, is the first part really, like, you can tell they're kind of figuring it out. And the sort of ineptitude, the mistakes they made are mistakes that are like people trying to play this game for the first time. And it really shows you like how easy it is in some regards to learn how to play D&D. You just kind of need to see it done live for you. And listening to that, it definitely it's the perfect actual play there, because it's like, oh, this just makes me want to play D&D with my friends, because I can see how much fun these people are having in this first session or so that they're doing. Yeah,
and that's, again, that is why we were so passionate about this. We know that many people got excited and were exposed to D&D from this podcast, and that it can be very exciting and inspiring, and it sounds a lot of the time like they're having fun. And one of my main criticism was that in Graduation, it did not sound like everybody was having fun. And it doesn't have to be that way. I still, after a few weeks after, I think that they put a lot of pressure on themselves to perform in a certain way when they should just have fun with each other the way they do on My Brother and Me. And that would be a perfectly good Dungeons and Dragons campaign.
As long as when you have rolls and someone rolls like a 25 on like a basic level check, you say, okay, yes, you succeed.
Right.
Right.
Respect
your players' rolls. If they get a good roll, the good thing happens.
Respect the roll.
Bad roll, bad thing happens. Otherwise, don't call for a roll.
Yeah. If they can't succeed, don't have them roll. This is a good rule we've talked about a bunch.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maddie, for writing.
All right. Well, that one was pretty positive. What about one?
I've got one more that I want to answer for our last one.
There's definitely some really good criticism of our criticism.
I want to read this one from Liam,
let's hear it,
because I think it's this most recent one. Okay, so this one is from Liam. Liam writes, "Hello, I'm a new listener to your show, brought in by your TAZ episode. Your analysis of Graduation was rock solid for the most part, and I'll be taking several of your tips to my own table. Thanks for that. Because I'm a fucking pedant, we love that. We love pedants. You are welcome. You are in good company, Liam. I'm in your inbox.
And this is a safe place for pedantry in all forms.
Yes.
Both coming and going.
I'm in your inbox to make an extremely pedantic point, but one that does actually matter to me. You invoke the principle of showing versus telling. I agree with the point you invoked the principle to support. It's just that show don't tell is bad writing advice that I hate. It's true that there is nothing wrong with Graduation's core conceit, and it's true that Travis drove whatever potential it had into the ground by failing to dramatize anything about the world. I also concede that show don't tell is often used as a shorthand to introduce pretty complex storytelling methods to people that don't have the language to understand what they're doing yet. When you said show don't tell in your podcast, I understood you to mean that Travis failed to use the elements of his world as fuel for collaborative drama, which is the core reason that Graduation failed to have any drama whatsoever. Again, that's true, and it's a great point. But applying show don't tell as a general rule eliminates all kinds of great possibilities. Friends at the Table has a great example in episode 7 of, and I don't know how to say this, so I'm going to guess, Sung Fiel, where the party decides to kill a pale magistrate. Because they'd already told the audience exactly what pale magistrates are and what they represent, who decides what justice is? Unfortunately, it's the person holding the gun. The audience gets to feel the full weight of that choice immediately. It's good. It works because they told rather than showing. Anyway, otherwise I enjoyed the episode. Look forward to tuning into your actual play. Best, Liam. Liam, this is a really good point. Thank you for writing.
I think it's a great point. And here's one of the things about like dungeon master advice in general is I think Rob and I try and come up with general applicable things, but almost would you agree with this, Rob? Almost nothing that you can say as dungeon master advice is universally applicable.
Yeah,
and I think
think
we
that's
need to mention
absolutely
that more.
True.
Right?
And DMing is a lot like writing, in which that you must know the rules so that you can break them intelligently. And show don't tell is a good example of this. So Liam's correct that this is advice that is often leveled at writers that is misunderstood. And it's because new writers, much like new DMs, have a bad habit of leaning on wordy, boring exposition rather than just demonstrating through drama or action the thing that they want to demonstrate. That being said, Liam's also 100% correct that there are times when it is just good and excellent writing or DMing to tell people what's happening, both from like a drama standpoint and from just structuring the adventure or the narrative. So I'm glad that Liam wrote to us about this because
because if you took our advice from that podcast, like, and because we didn't have these caveats, you might think, oh, everything has to be shown. Well, one of the things that you often just need to tell your players is you need to tell them all the information they need to know for what's going on so that they can make a choice that they feel the consequences of, that they know the stakes of, right? And
right.
That goes, we need to add that caveat, nuance.
Well, in the example that we used
to our advice,
right, when 5 minutes into the podcast, 10 minutes, Travis explains the entire structure of the villains and heroes and the guild, that just robbed it of all interest. But there may have been a place for that further down the road after the players had spent some time dealing with heroes and villains, and then they like noticed that there were some like retired villains or heroes who had become teachers or whatever, and then they ask somebody for an explanation, and then that might be a good time for Travis to sort of fill in anything that they had not sort of intuited on their own. Sometimes this happens to me a lot, is that I let my players discover things, but then they're missing critical information, and so they just ask somebody, or they just do a knowledge check, and that's a good time for me to exactly this, tell, hopefully in a way that fits with the narrative. They're learning it from an NPC, or they're reading it in a relevant book, and so it feels like it's part of the story. But there is a time and a place for telling, both just from presenting that information and in a way that can be dramatic and serve the story. So this is a good point. If you didn't know that there are important caveats here, you might think that you should never tell your players anything, and that will not work that barely works for storytelling if you're like an expert writer, and it does not work for Dungeons and Dragons. You are going to have to just tell them things sometimes. So that is a important like exception to this rule.
Right. And if my dumb brain can properly interpret Liam's excellent writing and storytelling advice here, is the show don't tell depends on the context, right? How are you using this to create, as Liam says, fuel for collaborative drama, right? And if players are making, a choice, right, or a decision, right, they need to know all the context and facts, right? And sometimes that involves telling them, things, right? If you're setting up an idea or something about your world that is the drama in your, in and of itself, right? That might be something you want to show.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Right?
It does make
As
sense.
to distinguish when to tell and when to show.
Well, and that's what's hard about this is that, well, with so many things in life, it's hard to apply a universal rule. There are, unfortunately, art, social interactions, Dungeons and Dragons, it's not like gravity, right? There's not one right way. It doesn't behave the same way all the time. You're going to have to make some judgment calls. Generally, the reason why we lean on this is that a more common rookie mistake is telling more than showing.
When you should be showing.
When you should be showing. That being said, it would be equally erroneous to always show and never tell. So this was an important... Thank you, Liam, for your pedantry, because we love it. And
it's important
also,
pedantry.
It gave us opportunity to talk about something important here.
It reminds me of I took a course in college where one of my professors brought up the interesting fact that, as a universal rule, he was all in on like globalization and the spread of democracy.
I already know what this one is.
No two nations that have a McDonald's franchise in them had gone to war.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately after that class ended, Georgia and Russia
went to war. I remember learning that rule. Sorry.
Really?
Yes. Youngins among you will not remember the McDonald's rule, but this used to be like a big
didn't last long.
Big hurrah in the glorious neoliberal days of the aughts that no two countries with McDonald's had ever gone to war with each other. That was 2008 when that got broken, and then it's been repeatedly broken again and again and again. God, there are a whole bunch of those. God, I think, didn't Tony Blair even say just no two democracies period have ever gone to war with each other or something like that?
That's insane.
These rules are absolutely...
That was false when Blair said it.
Right.
So yeah.
It's an important lesson about trying to make rules about human behavior that are universal, because no matter how hard you try to make it a safe thing for you to say, people just don't work like that. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for writing, everybody. Thank you for listening. Please send us more questions if you can. Email us at dmofnone@gmail.com. Add us on Twitter at dmofnone. If you would like additional DM of None content, we now have a Patreon at patreon.com/dungeonmasterofnone. We currently have one bonus episode, several pieces of homebrew. We are working on...
And then, what are we working on for next month?
Well, people have been asking, and I think we should try to provide completed versions of both Dice Hard and the Monongahela's of Madness.
Okay, there's your promise for what will that be? The June 2021 Patreon bonus content.
That's right. So for next month...
Thank you, everyone, for writing in and asking us to do those things.
For next month, our actual preps, you will have access to a final version of that, and you can go back and listen to those episodes to know what we're talking about. But one of them is a one-shot based on Die Hard, as you might guess, and the other is a Call of Cthulhu adventure Matt designed, takes place in rural Appalachia. We're very proud of them, and we do want to get to the point where they
share them with you.
Yeah, an actual adventure that you can run. So stay tuned for that. And
as you heard on our teaser, if you sign up for the Patreon right now, you can go ahead and listen to us create 4 villains for your campaigns, and then take the stats and write-ups for them and use them.
Yeah.
So join us.
So check that out. Write us, ask us questions, leave a review, rating, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Thanks, everybody. Stay healthy. Good luck getting vaccinated, and keep rolling them dice.